1867, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. An 8-year-old boy pressed 2 fingers against a dead girl's throat and counted. His lips moved silently, precisely, the way a surgeon counts a pulse that is no longer there. Around him, mothers screamed, fathers dropped to their knees, and Timothy Caldwell looked up from the body of 5-year-old Josephine Monroe with an expression that no one in that crowd could name. Because it was not grief, it was not shock, it was not fear. It was completion. He had finished his 3rd experiment, and nobody in this broken, bleeding, post-war South understood what they were witnessing. If this story grips you, subscribe to this channel and stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far Timothy Caldwell's story reaches. Caleb Caldwell was drunk when the letter arrived. Not stumbling drunk, functioning drunk. The kind of drunk that had become his natural state since the Confederacy collapsed and took everything he owned with it. A freedman on horseback delivered it. 2 copper pennies for the ride from the parish courthouse. Caleb unfolded it on the porch, read it twice, then crushed it in his fist. Margaret came to the door. "Who's that from?" "The court. Samuel's boy, Timothy. They're sending him here." "Sending him here? When?" "Saturday." Margaret was quiet for a long moment.
"We can barely feed James and Lucy."
"I know that."
"Then why are we taking him?"
Caleb turned around and looked at his wife with bloodshot eyes. "Because nobody else will. And because he's got 2 hands, Margaret. He can work." That was the deal. Not love, not family. Labor. Timothy Caldwell was coming to earn his keep or starve. His father, Samuel, had rotted to death in a Union prison camp 3 months before Lee surrendered. His mother, Annabelle, outlasted the war by 1 winter before tuberculosis filled her lungs and drowned her from the inside. Timothy watched her die over 6 weeks in a boarding house in Natchez. He was 7. He did not cry at her funeral. The boarding house owner told the parish authorities the boy had simply stood at the graveside, hands folded, studying the coffin as it went into the ground, like he was memorizing the process. Nobody thought much of it. Orphans were everywhere in 1867. Grief took strange shapes. People had stopped asking questions. The freight wagon pulled up Saturday morning. Timothy sat between 2 grain sacks, clutching a leather satchel against his chest. The driver, Parsons, helped him down and leaned toward Caleb. "Quiet kid. Whole ride, not a word. Polite, though. Almost too polite." Caleb grunted. He looked at the boy. Timothy looked back. Gray eyes, unblinking. Steady as stone. "You're my uncle," Timothy said. Not a question. "I am."
"You'll call me sir."
"Yes, sir."
Margaret knelt in front of him and touched his cheek. His skin was cool. He didn't pull away. He didn't lean in. He just allowed it, the way you'd allow a stranger to take your pulse. "Are you hungry, sweetheart?"
"No, ma'am, but thank you for asking."
That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret grabbed Caleb's arm in the hallway.
"Something's off with that boy."
"He just lost his mother, Margaret. I know what a grieving child looks like, Caleb. I buried 2 of my own before James was born. That boy isn't grieving. When I touched his face, he looked at my hand like he was trying to figure out the reason behind it, not feeling it, calculating it." "You're imagining things." "Am I?" He pulled his arm free. "Give him time." Margaret gave him time. 3 weeks. Timothy worked like a machine. Up before dawn, water hauled, chickens fed, wood stacked, floor swept. All done before James and Lucy opened their eyes. He never complained, never asked for anything, never raised his voice. Lucy adored him instantly. She followed him everywhere, chattering about frogs and dolls and her favorite climbing tree. Timothy listened to every word. He nodded at the right moments. He smiled when she laughed. But Dr. Nathaniel Whitaker saw through that smile the first time he witnessed it. Whitaker visited the farm every 2 weeks to treat Margaret's recurring fever.
He'd served as a Confederate field surgeon at Shiloh and Vicksburg. He'd sawed limbs off screaming boys by candlelight while artillery shook the walls. He'd watched hundreds of men die, some howling, some silent. He knew what trauma looked like in every possible shape, and he knew what absence looked like.
"That boy's smile doesn't reach his eyes," he told his wife Eleanor over dinner. "It's manufactured. He watches people react and then copies the appropriate expression half a second later, like he's translating a foreign language in his head." Eleanor sighed. "He's 8 years old, Nathaniel. He's an orphan." "I've treated orphans. They cry, they rage, they cling, they break things, they wet their beds. Timothy does none of that. He performs. Every response is a performance, and it's flawless, and that is exactly what terrifies me." But Whitaker kept it to himself. He had no proof, just instinct. And instinct didn't carry weight in a parish that was still arguing about whether freed black men deserved to walk on the same roads as white ones. Then the animals started dying. 6 weeks after Timothy arrived, April. A freedman named Ezekiel Monroe found his goat dead in the field. Not mauled, not diseased. Cut. A single clean incision across the throat, precise as a surgical line. Monroe carried the carcass straight to Caleb. "This wasn't no animal, Mr. Caldwell. Someone took a blade to my goat, and whoever did it wasn't trying to eat. They was trying to learn." Caleb stiffened. "Learn what?" "How things die." "Could be drifters. Roads are full of desperate men." Monroe stared at him. "Desperate men take the meat, sir. This one left the meat and took the knowledge." 2 weeks later, another goat, same cut. Then a dog from the Bro farm, same method. Then 3 of Caleb's own chickens, found behind the coop with their abdomens opened and their organs removed and arranged in a straight line on the dirt. Neat, symmetrical, deliberate. Margaret screamed when she found them. James ran out and started crying. Lucy buried her face in Margaret's skirt. Timothy walked out from behind the barn, hands clean, face blank. "What happened?" he asked. His voice carried exactly the right measure of concern, exactly the right pitch, like a note played on a perfectly tuned instrument. Margaret seized his shoulders. "Were you near the coop this morning?" "No, ma'am. I was stacking wood on the east side. I didn't hear anything unusual." She searched his face. He held her gaze without a flicker, without a twitch, without anything human behind those gray eyes at all. That night she slammed her hand on the kitchen table hard enough to rattle the cups. "It's him, Caleb. It started when he got here." "He's always first to the bodies, and he never reacts. Never." James is 10 years old, and he sobbed over those chickens. Your nephew looked at them like he was reading a page in a textbook. He's a child. Then explain the cuts. Explain the organs laid out in a row. What kind of drifter does that? What kind of 8-year-old does that? The question hung between them like smoke. Neither one could answer it. Caleb poured another whiskey. Margaret went to check on the children, and nothing changed, because Caleb Caldwell was a man already drowning in failure, and admitting he'd brought a predator into his home meant admitting one more thing he could not survive. So Whitaker watched instead. He increased his visits, twice a week now, always with a medical excuse, always bringing peppermint candy. But his real patient was Timothy. He tested the boy,
Careful, quiet conversations designed to reveal what was underneath. Do you miss your mother, Timothy?
Very much, sir.
What do you miss most? A pause, brief, controlled.
Her voice. She sang to me every night before I slept.
Perfect answer. Whitaker's stomach turned. He'd interviewed hundreds of war orphans. Real grief was ugly and specific. A real child would say, "I miss how she burned the cornbread," or "I miss the sound her shoes made on the kitchen floor." They'd laugh and choke on tears at the same time. Their memories were messy, imperfect, alive. Timothy's memories were scripts, polished, rehearsed, delivered with the precision of an actor who had studied his role but never understood the play.
Do you have friends here, Timothy? Lucy is very kind to me.
And James?
James is cautious. I understand. I'm new.
Does it bother you that he keeps his distance? Another pause, shorter this time.
I hope he'll trust me eventually.
Every answer impeccable. Every inflection calibrated. Whitaker left that conversation and sat in his buggy for 10 minutes without moving, gripping the reins until his knuckles turned white. Then May arrived, and everything shifted from suspicion to horror. Josephine Monroe, 5 years old, daughter of Ezekiel Monroe, was found face down in a shallow creek at the edge of her father's property. The water was 6 inches deep. She played in that creek since she could walk. She could swim. There was no earthly reason for that child to drown in water that barely covered her face. No bruises, no marks, no sign of force. The coroner, a Reconstruction appointee named Dupree, ruled it accidental. Tragic, but unremarkable. Ezekiel Monroe stood outside Dupree's office and raged until the sheriff threatened chains. "My girl could swim before she could run. Somebody held my baby's face in that water and you won't even look because she's black." Because her life don't cost enough for you to care. Nobody investigated. In 1867, Louisiana, a freedman's dead child was a line in a ledger, a statistic, a shrug. But Whitaker did not shrug, because Timothy Caldwell had found the body. He'd walked onto Monroe's property at dawn, knelt beside the creek, placed 2 fingers on Josephine's throat, and called for help in a voice so calm, so measured, so perfectly controlled, that Whitaker felt his blood go cold when he heard it replayed by witnesses. When Whitaker arrived at the scene, Timothy stood 3 feet from the body, watching. "Dr. Whitaker?" "Yes, Timothy." "How long would it take someone to drown in shallow water if they couldn't lift their head?" Whitaker's hands stopped moving. He turned slowly and looked at the boy. Timothy tilted his head, slightly, the way a bird tilts its head when examining something small and crawling beneath it. "I only ask because I want to understand what happened to Josephine. It must have been very frightening for her." The words were compassionate. The tone was textbook. The eyes were empty rooms. Whitaker didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had closed, because in that moment, standing over the body of a dead child, while an 8-year-old boy asked him clinical questions about the mechanics of drowning, Nathaniel Whitaker understood something that no medical textbook in 1867 could give him language for. He went home that night. He locked his study door. He lit a single candle, and he wrote a passage in his private journal that would remain sealed for over 100 years. "I have examined this child with every tool my profession affords me. I have listened to his words. I have studied his reactions. I have tested his emotions the way a man tests ice before crossing a frozen river. And I tell you now, with the certainty of a man who has watched 1,000 soldiers die, that Timothy Caldwell does not feel. Not grief, not guilt, not love, not fear.
He observes human suffering the way a naturalist pins a butterfly to a board. He is 8 years old, and he is, without question, the most dangerous human being I have encountered in 30 years of practicing medicine. I do not know what to call him. I do not know what made him. I only know that God did not finish this child, and whatever was left out cannot be put back in. He closed the journal. He blew out the candle.
And 3 miles away, in the room Caleb Caldwell had given him at the back of the farmhouse, Timothy sat cross-legged on his bed, with his leather satchel open. Inside it was the journal his mother had given him. He turned to a fresh page and began to draw. The drawing was of Josephine Monroe, face down, creek water around her hair, fingers splayed in the mud. Below the drawing, in small, careful handwriting, he wrote a single line. 6 minutes, longer than expected. He closed the journal, placed it back in the satchel, and lay down in the dark with his eyes open, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of Ezekiel Monroe weeping for his daughter through the thin summer air. Timothy did not blink. He was already designing the next one. 2 days after they buried Josephine Monroe, Ezekiel came to the Caldwell farm with a shotgun. It was early. Fog still clung to the ground. Caleb was on the porch with coffee when he saw the figure walking up the dirt road, barrel glinting in the gray morning light. Caleb set his cup down and stood. "Ezekiel, put that weapon down." Monroe stopped 20 feet from the porch. His eyes were red, his hands were shaking, but his voice was iron. "Where's the boy?" "What boy?" "Don't you play ignorant with me, Caldwell. Your nephew, the quiet one. Where is he?" Caleb stepped to the edge of the porch. "You need to turn around and go home." "My daughter is in the ground," Monroe's voice cracked. The shotgun rose an inch. "My baby girl, who could swim better than half the boys in this parish, is dead in 6 inches of water, and your nephew was the one who found her. He was the first one there, at dawn, on my land." "You tell me why an 8-year-old white boy was walking my property before the sun came up." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He wanders. He's a child. Children wander." "Children don't wander onto a freedman's land in Louisiana, Mr. Caldwell. Not in 1867. Not unless they've got a reason." The screen door opened. Margaret stepped out. She saw the gun and froze. "Go back inside, Margaret." She didn't move. She looked at Monroe, and something in her face shifted. Not fear. Recognition. Because Margaret Caldwell had been carrying the same suspicion Monroe was carrying, and hearing another human being speak it out loud nearly broke her open. "Ezekiel," she said quietly, "come inside. Put the gun on the porch and come inside." Caleb turned to her sharply. "Margaret?" "Shut up, Caleb." Monroe stared at her, the shotgun lowered slowly. He leaned it against the porch railing and followed her through the door. They sat at the kitchen table. Margaret poured coffee. Her hands were steady, but her mouth was tight. Caleb stood against the wall with his arms crossed, furious, cornered, refusing to sit because sitting meant participating. Monroe wrapped both hands around his cup and spoke to the table. 3 weeks before Josie died, I found my goat cut open. Clean, surgical. I told your husband it wasn't an animal. He said drifters. Then another goat. Then the bro dog. Then your own chickens, all cut the same way. All within half a mile of this house. And then my daughter. Margaret nodded slowly. I know. You know? I've known something was wrong since the day he arrived. He doesn't react to anything, Ezekiel. Pain, death, grief, nothing touches him. He copies what he sees other people do, but underneath, there's nothing. I told Caleb. He won't listen. Caleb pushed off the wall. "Because there's nothing to listen to. You're accusing an 8-year-old orphan of murder based on a feeling, Margaret. A feeling."
"And the animals?" "I don't know about the animals," Monroe cut in, his voice low and dangerous. "My daughter had mud under her fingernails, both hands. She was clawing at the ground, Mr. Caldwell. A girl who drowns by accident in shallow water rolls over. She pushes herself up. She doesn't claw at the earth like something is holding her down." Silence hit the room like a hammer. Margaret put her hand over her mouth. Caleb stared at Monroe. And from the hallway, just beyond the kitchen door, a floorboard creaked. All three of them turned. Nobody was there, but Margaret whispered, "He was listening." June 1867. The heat thickened. The tension spread. Monroe told other freedmen in the area what he suspected. Word traveled fast through the community. Within a week, every black family within 2 miles of the Caldwell property pulled their children indoors at sunset. Mothers walked their sons and daughters to the creek and back. Fathers slept with axes beside their beds. Nobody went to the sheriff. They knew better. A freedman accusing a white child of murder in Reconstruction, Louisiana, was a death sentence for the freedman, not the child. But they watched, and they waited, and they kept their children close. Dr. Whitaker heard the rumors from his housekeeper, a freedwoman named Clara, who attended church with Monroe's wife. "They're saying the Caldwell boy killed Josie Monroe," Clara told him while folding linens. "They're saying he cut those animals too. Every black family on the South Road is terrified, Doctor. They won't let their children outside alone." Whitaker sat in his chair for a long time after Clara left. He stared at the wall. Then he rose, put on his coat, and rode to the Caldwell farm. He found Timothy behind the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket reading a book. The leather satchel sat beside him, closed, the journal inside it invisible but ever present. "Good afternoon, Timothy."
"Good afternoon, Dr. Whitaker." "What are you reading?" Timothy held up the book. It was a veterinary manual. Caleb owned it for treating livestock ailments. The chapter Timothy had opened was about the internal anatomy of mammals. "Interesting subject," Whitaker said carefully. "Very interesting, sir. Did you know that the internal organs of a goat are arranged almost identically to those of a large dog? The liver sits in the same position. The intestines coil the same way. If you understand one, you understand the other." Whitaker's stomach clenched. "Where did you learn that?" "From this book, sir." "Only from the book?" Timothy looked up at him. Those gray eyes, flat, reflective, like water covering something deep and dark and still. "Where else would I learn it, Doctor?" Whitaker changed his approach. He sat down on a hay bale and folded his hands. "Timothy, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "I always answer honestly, sir."
"Josephine Monroe, you found her in the creek. Tell me exactly what you did that morning, from the beginning." Timothy closed the book and set it on his lap. "I woke early, before dawn. I couldn't sleep because of the heat. I walked toward the creek because I wanted to cool my feet in the water. When I got there, I saw Josephine lying face down. I ran to her and checked her pulse the way I've seen you do it. She didn't have one. I called for help." "You checked her pulse?" "Yes, sir." "You're 8 years old. Most 8-year-olds don't know how to check a pulse." "I'm not most 8-year-olds, sir. I watch you very carefully when you examine Aunt Margaret. I've learned a great deal from watching you." The words landed like stones in Whitaker's chest. "I watch you very carefully. I've learned a great deal from watching you." A compliment wrapped around a confession, delivered with a child's smile. "Were you frightened?" Whitaker asked. "When you found her?" "Very frightened, sir." "You didn't sound frightened. The people who heard you call for help said your voice was calm."
Another pause. Timothy blinked once, twice. Then,
"Sometimes when I'm very scared, I become very still. My mother used to say I went somewhere else inside my head. I think that's what happened."
beautiful answer. Flawless construction. Whitaker wanted to believe it. Part of him, the part that still needed to trust in childhood and innocence and the basic goodness of human beings, wanted desperately to believe this boy was simply damaged, traumatized, broken in a way that could be repaired. But the other part, the surgeon who had held dying men's hands in field hospitals while their blood soaked through his shirt, that part knew better.
"Thank you, Timothy," Whitaker said, and stood up.
"Doctor?" "Yes?" "Are people saying I hurt Josephine?" The question was direct. No hesitation, no fear. No child who was falsely accused would ask the question that way. A real child would cry, deny, run to an adult for protection. Timothy asked it the way a chess player asks whether his opponent has noticed a particular move. Whitaker looked at him for a long moment. "Should they be?" Timothy smiled, small, controlled. "No, sir. I liked Josephine. She was kind to me." Whitaker left the farm and rode directly to Sheriff Thibodeau's office in Baton Rouge. July 1867. The meeting lasted 40 minutes and accomplished nothing. "You want me to investigate an 8-year-old orphan for murder," Thibodeau said, leaning back in his chair. "Based on what? A freedman's accusation and a country doctor's gut feeling?" "Based on a pattern," Whitaker said. "Animals mutilated with surgical precision. A child who shows no emotional response to death. A drowning that makes no physical sense. And a boy who was present at every single incident." "Coincidence? There are too many coincidences, Sheriff." Thibodeau picked up a toothpick and worked it between his teeth. "Doctor, I've got night riders burning freedmen's houses 3 counties over. I've got a Reconstruction government breathing down my neck. I've got half this parish ready to start another war because they can't accept that they lost the first one. And you want me to arrest a white child on the word of a Negro farmer? Do you understand what that would do to this town? I understand what that boy will do to this town if you don't." Thibodeau pointed the toothpick at him. "Bring me evidence, real evidence, not feelings, not patterns. Something I can hold in my hand and show a judge. Then we'll talk." Whitaker left the office, knowing that by the time evidence existed, someone else would be dead. He was right. It took 11 days. August 2nd, 1867. An elderly man named Thibaut Breau, 63 years old, a beekeeper who lived alone on a small ridge property east of the Caldwell farm, was found dead at the base of a limestone outcrop. His neck was broken. The ground at the top of the ridge showed scuff marks near the edge, but Dupree ruled it a fall. An old man, unsteady on his feet, wandering too close to a drop in poor light. Accidental death. Except Thibaut Breau had walked that ridge every morning for 31 years and never once stumbled. Except his dog, a hound named Belle, who never left his side, was found tied to a fence post 200 yards away. Something Breau never did, because he let that dog follow him everywhere. Except the scuff marks at the edge of the ridge didn't look like slipping. They looked like struggling. And except Timothy Caldwell was seen walking the east road toward the Breau property at dawn that morning by Clara, Whitaker's housekeeper, who was collecting herbs in the field nearby. "I saw him plain as I see you now, Doctor," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Walking fast, hands in his pockets, head down, purposeful, a child on an errand." "Did he see you?" "I don't think so. I was behind the hedgerow." "What time?" "Just after first light, maybe 5:30. "And when did they find Breau's body?" "Before 7. 90 minutes. Whitaker closed his eyes. 90 minutes between a boy walking purposefully toward an old man's property and that old man lying dead at the bottom of a ridge with his dog tied to a fence post he never used. He rode to the farm that afternoon. He didn't ask for Caleb. He went straight to Timothy. The boy was in the kitchen, helping Margaret shell peas. Lucy sat beside him, humming a song. Margaret looked up when Whitaker entered and read his face instantly. "Lucy, go play outside." "But Mama, I'm helping." "Now, Lucy." Lucy left. Margaret stayed. She folded her arms and leaned against the counter, and Whitaker understood that she was done pretending. "Timothy," Whitaker said, "Mr. Bro died this morning." Timothy's hands stopped moving over the peas. He looked up. "That's terrible, sir. What happened?" "He fell from the ridge." "How awful. He was a kind man. He gave me honey once." "Timothy, someone saw you walking toward Mr. Bro's property early this morning." The room contracted. Margaret's breath caught. Timothy's hands remained still over the bowl of peas. And then, something Whitaker had never seen before. A crack. Tiny, almost invisible. The corner of Timothy's mouth twitched. Not in fear, not in surprise, in amusement. It lasted less than a second. Then the mask slid back into place. "I walk every morning, sir."
The heat keeps me awake. I walk different directions on different days. I may have walked that road, but I didn't go to Mr. Bro's property. I turned back before the ridge. "Why did you turn back?" "I heard Belle barking. I didn't want to disturb Mr. Bro." "Belle was tied to a fence post, Timothy, 200 yards from the ridge. She couldn't have been barking at the ridge if she was tied that far away." Silence. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Whitaker counted them the way Timothy counted everything. Then Timothy said, "I must be confused about where I heard the barking. I'm sorry, Doctor. Sounds carry strangely in the morning." Margaret spoke from behind them. Her voice was barely controlled. "Timothy, look at me." He turned. "Did you hurt Mr. Bro?" "No, ma'am." "Did you hurt Josephine?" "No, ma'am." "Did you kill those animals?" "No, ma'am." 3 denials. Same tone, same cadence, same empty eyes. Margaret gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles whitened. Whitaker took the boy's hand gently. "Timothy, I need to look in your satchel." For the first time since arriving at the Caldwell farm, Timothy reacted with speed. He pulled his hand back and clutched the satchel behind his body. "No." "Why not?" "It's mine. My mother gave it to me. It's private." "I'm a doctor. I'm trying to help you." "I don't need help, sir." "Timothy." "I said no." Margaret moved toward the satchel. Timothy's head snapped toward her, and for one raw, unguarded instant, the mask dropped completely. What Whitaker saw in that boy's face was not fear of being caught. It was territorial rage, the cold, calculated fury of a creature whose territory had been threatened. It passed in a heartbeat. The polite, composed, soft-spoken orphan returned. But they had both seen it, and they could not unsee it. "Caleb!" Margaret shouted. Caleb stumbled in from the porch, half drunk as always. "What? What's happening?" "Take the boy's satchel." "What? Why?" "Because I'm asking you to. Because Dr. Whitaker is asking you to. Because 3 people are dead, and that satchel has not left your nephew's hands since the day he arrived. Take it, now." Caleb looked at Whitaker. Whitaker nodded once. Caleb reached for the satchel. Timothy stepped back. Caleb grabbed his arm. Timothy twisted. For an 8-year-old, his strength was shocking. Caleb had to use both hands to pry the leather strap from the boy's grip. He opened it. Inside was the journal. Caleb flipped it open. The first few pages were ordinary, a child's handwriting, notes about the weather, a drawing of a horse. Then page 12, the goat, sketched in detail, the incision drawn with anatomical precision. Notes beside it reading, cut along the ventral midline, organs intact, liver slightly larger than expected. Time from first incision to cessation of movement, 4 minutes. Page 15, the dog, same clinical detail. Lateral incision, exposed rib cage, heart continued beating for 90 seconds after opening the chest cavity. Page 20, Josephine Monroe, face down in the creek, hair spreading in the water, fingers in the mud, and below the drawing, in handwriting so steady it could have been printed by a machine. Subject submerged at 5:47, ceased movement at 5:53. 6 minutes, longer than expected. Possible contributing factor, stronger neck muscles in human children versus animal subjects. Margaret vomited into the sink. Caleb dropped the journal like it had burned him. Timothy stood in the center of the kitchen and looked at all three adults with an expression of absolute calm. "You weren't supposed to see that yet," he said. "Not, I didn't do it. Not, I'm sorry. Not, please forgive me. You weren't supposed to see that yet." Whitaker picked the journal up from the floor. His hands were shaking so badly the pages rattled. He turned to the last entry, dated that morning, August 2nd, 1867. A sketch of the limestone ridge, a figure at the edge, and below it, in Timothy's meticulous script, subject required physical redirection toward the edge, used lateral push at the knees. Collapse was immediate. Fall time approximately 2 seconds. Impact sufficient. Dog secured at 5:15 to prevent interference. Experiment confirms. Gravity is reliable but imprecise. Further testing needed. Further testing needed. Whitaker closed the journal. He looked at Timothy. The boy looked back at him with those flat, gray, bottomless eyes and said the words that Nathaniel Whitaker would carry to his grave. "You're frightened, Doctor. I can see it in your hands. But you shouldn't be. I'm not finished, and you're far more useful to me alive than dead. For now." Margaret screamed for Caleb to get the boy out of the house. Caleb grabbed Timothy by the collar and dragged him to the barn and locked him inside. Whitaker rode to town at a full gallop and returned within the hour with 2 sheriff's deputies who had been told only that a child needed to be restrained. When they opened the barn, Timothy was sitting cross-legged on the hay, hands folded in his lap, humming a hymn his mother used to sing. He looked up at the deputies and smiled. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said. "I've been expecting you." The deputies bound Timothy's wrists with rope, not shackles. He was 8 years old, and the law had no provision for shackling a child, even one who had just confessed to killing 3 people with the detachment of a man cataloging insects. Deputy Marchand, the older of the 2, carried the boy to the wagon. Timothy did not resist. He walked between them with his hands bound in front of him, his steps measured, his posture straight, his chin lifted slightly, the way a man walks to a podium, not a gallows. Marchand had fought at Chickamauga. He had seen men ripped apart by grape shot. He had held a dying 17-year-old drummer boy who screamed for 40 minutes before God finally took mercy. He thought nothing on earth could unsettle him anymore. But when Timothy looked up at him in the wagon and said, "Deputy, how far is the parish jail from here?" Marchand felt something cold crawl up the back of his neck. Because the question wasn't asked in fear, it was asked the way a traveler asks the distance to the next town. Practical, calm, planning ahead. "Far enough," Marchand said. "Will I have my own cell?" "You'll go where we put you." Timothy nodded. "I hope so. I don't sleep well near others. They breathe too loudly." Marchand looked at his partner, Deputy Fontenot, and neither man spoke for the rest of the ride. August 3rd, 1867.
Sheriff Thibodeau stood in his office, staring at the journal Whitaker had placed on his desk. He had not opened it. He didn't need to. Whitaker had read him every relevant entry, word by word, and Thibodeau had listened with his arms crossed and his face turning from skepticism to disbelief to something Whitaker had never seen on the man's face before. Revulsion. "He wrote it down," Thibodeau said. "He documented every killing like a ledger." "He documented everything," Whitaker said. "Times, methods, physical responses of the victims, his own observations. He even noted what he would do differently next time. He's not confessing, Sheriff. He's publishing research." Thibodeau finally opened the journal. He turned to the page with Josephine Monroe's drawing. He stared at it for a long time. The careful detail, the steady handwriting. The clinical measurement of a child's death recorded by another child. He closed it and pushed it away. "What do you want me to do with this, doctor? I can't try him. There's no court in Louisiana that will put an 8-year-old on trial for murder. The Reconstruction government would shut me down before I finished filing the charges. And even if I could try him, what jury would convict? His defense would be simple. He's a child, a traumatized war orphan, a boy who lost both parents and retreated into fantasy. Any lawyer worth his salt would have him crying on the witness stand within 10 minutes, and every woman on the jury would vote to acquit." "He can cry on command," Whitaker said quietly. Thibodeau looked at him. "He can produce tears at will. I've watched him do it. When Lucy Caldwell fell and scraped her knee last month, Timothy cried alongside her. Perfect tears, perfect timing. And then the moment she stopped crying, he stopped instantly, like blowing out a candle." Thibodeau sat down heavily. "Then what in God's name are we dealing with?" "Something medicine has no name for, something the law has no framework to address. He is a child who does not experience human emotion, not anger, not love, not remorse, not fear. He observes emotion in others and replicates it so convincingly that no one questions him. He has been doing this his entire life, and he is getting better at it." "You're describing a monster. I'm describing a patient, one I cannot treat because I don't know what the disease is." Thibodeau rubbed his face with both hands. "I'll send word to the state insane asylum in Jackson. If I can't prosecute him, I can commit him. A physician's recommendation and a sheriff's order should be enough. But Whitaker, I'm telling you now, if that place can't hold him, if he walks out of there, this comes back on both of us. If he walks out of there, Sheriff, it comes back on everyone." The commitment papers were drafted that afternoon, but before Timothy could be transferred, Thibodeau needed a formal examination on record. That meant Whitaker had to sit across from the boy one more time and conduct an interview for the official file. August 4th, 1867. The parish jail. A single room with a cot, a bucket, and a barred window. Timothy sat on the cot with his legs crossed, his hands resting on his knees. He had not eaten the food they brought him. Not because he was distressed, because he said the bread was stale and he preferred to wait for something better. Whitaker entered with a notebook and a pen. He sat on a stool across from the boy. Thibodeau stood outside the cell, listening. "Timothy, I need to ask you some questions for the official record." "Of course, Doctor. I'm happy to cooperate." "Tell me about the animals, the goats, the dog, the chickens. When did it start?" Timothy tilted his head, the bird gesture. Whitaker had seen it a dozen times now, and it still made his skin tighten. "It started with a frog. Before I came to Uncle Caleb's farm, in Natchez, there was a pond behind the boarding house. I caught a frog and opened it with a kitchen knife. I wanted to see what made it move. The heart was still beating when I separated it from the body. It beat for 11 seconds,
I counted. How old were you? 7. My mother had just died. People assumed I was grieving. They left me alone.
Were you grieving? Timothy considered this, not as a person considers a painful memory, but as a scholar considers a theoretical question. I observed that other people were grieving. My mother's landlady cried. The minister cried. The women from the church cried. I watched them very carefully. I noticed that grief follows a pattern. First shock, then denial, then anger, then sadness, then acceptance. I practiced each stage in front of a mirror until I could produce them convincingly. It took me 3 days. Whitaker's pen stopped. You practiced grief in a mirror? Yes, sir. I needed to appear normal. I understood very early that if people believed I was sad, they would leave me alone, and I needed to be left alone for my work. Your work. My experiments, Doctor. Surely you understand. You're a man of science yourself. Whitaker set the pen down. Timothy, do you understand that you killed people? That Josephine was a child? That Mr. Bro was a living human being with a family? Mr. Bro lived alone, sir. His wife died in 1859. He had no children. I selected him partly for that reason. Fewer variables. And Josephine? For the first time, something shifted in Timothy's expression. Not remorse. Interest. Josephine was the most educational subject. Adult animals react to pain primarily through physical reflex, but a human child experiences something beyond reflex. Josephine was afraid, genuinely afraid. In the last 2 minutes, she stopped fighting and began to accept what was happening. Her body relaxed, her fingers unclenched. I had never witnessed that transition before, from resistance to surrender. It was remarkable. Behind Whitaker, outside the cell, Thibodeau turned away and put his hand against the wall. His shoulders moved. He might have been breathing hard. He might have been trying not to be sick. Whitaker forced himself to continue. You said in the kitchen that Dr. Whitaker was more useful alive than dead. What did you mean by that? Timothy smiled, the practiced smile, the one that looked almost real if you didn't know what was behind it. You're the only intelligent person in this area, Doctor. Everyone else is governed by emotion. Uncle Caleb by his bitterness, Aunt Margaret by her fear, Mr. Monroe by his anger, the sheriff by his politics. But you operate on logic, observation, evidence. You're the only one who actually saw me. That makes you interesting. Interesting how? I wanted to see how long it would take you to figure it out. And I wanted to see what you would do once you did. That was my next experiment. Not a physical one, a psychological one. Could a rational man, confronted with something he couldn't explain, maintain his rationality? Or would he collapse into the same emotional chaos as everyone else? And what's your conclusion? Timothy leaned forward slightly. You're shaking, Doctor. Your hand hasn't been steady since you sat down. Your voice cracked twice in the last 3 minutes. You're maintaining composure, but only barely. My conclusion is that rationality is a thin shell over a very deep ocean of fear, even in the best of men. Whitaker closed his notebook. He stood. He walked to the cell door. And then he stopped and turned back. Timothy, is there anything you feel? Anything at all? In your entire life, has any emotion ever been real? The boy was quiet for several seconds, longer than any pause Whitaker had observed from him. And when he spoke, his voice was different, not softer, not warmer. Stripped, bare, like a wall with the plaster knocked away, exposing the raw structure beneath.
I feel curiosity, Doctor. Constant, overwhelming, insatiable curiosity. It is the only thing that has ever been real inside me.
Everything else, the smiles, the tears, the politeness, the the charm, those are tools, things I built to move through a world that requires them. But curiosity is mine. It belongs to me, and it is the hungriest thing I have ever known. Whitaker left the cell. He did not go home. He walked to the edge of town, sat under a cypress tree, and stayed there until dark. August 12, 1867. The transfer wagon arrived from Jackson. 2 orderlies and an armed escort. Timothy was led out of the parish jail in wrist restraints, his small frame dwarfed by the men surrounding him. A crowd had gathered. Word had spread, though the official story was deliberately vague. A disturbed child, a tragic case. The details were sealed. Ezekiel Monroe stood across the street. He did not speak, he did not move. He watched the boy climb into the wagon with the same quiet, controlled fury he had carried to the Caldwell porch with a shotgun 10 days earlier. Timothy saw him. Their eyes met, and Timothy raised his bound hands slightly, not waving, not reaching, but showing them, displaying the restraints, as if to say, "Look what they've done to me," as if he were the victim. Monroe's fists clenched. His wife, Ruth, put her hand on his arm and pulled him back. "Don't give him what he wants, Zeke." "What does he want?" "A reaction. That's all he ever wanted from any of us." The wagon pulled away. Timothy did not look back. The Louisiana State Insane Asylum at Jackson was a sprawling brick complex built in 1848 to house the mentally ill, the criminally insane, and every other human being that polite Southern society wanted to forget existed. By 1867, it was overcrowded, understaffed, and running on a budget that had been gutted by the war. Patients slept 3 to a bed. The halls smelled of urine and carbolic acid. Doctors rotated through on 6-month assignments, most of them too young, too inexperienced, or too damaged by the war themselves to provide meaningful care. Timothy was admitted on August 15, 1867, under the care of Dr. Henri Gaston, a French-born alienist who had studied in Paris before emigrating to Louisiana in 1854. Gaston was 51, meticulous, skeptical, and deeply unimpressed by the paperwork that accompanied the boy. He read Whitaker's notes and then sat down across from Timothy in his office. "Your doctor in Baton Rouge believes you are dangerous," Gaston said. "Dr. Whitaker is a thoughtful man," Timothy replied. "But he's frightened. Frightened people exaggerate." "He says you killed a child." "He says many things." "Did you?" Timothy studied Gaston the way he studied everyone, reading him, measuring him, calculating the appropriate response for this specific audience. "Doctor." "Gaston, I am 8 years old. I have lost both my parents. I was sent to live with an uncle who resented me. I was lonely, confused, and surrounded by death. I kept a journal because my mother told me writing would help me process my feelings. Some of what I wrote was real. Some of it was imagination. A child's way of making sense of a senseless world. Dr. Whitaker read my journal and interpreted a grieving boy's fantasies as confessions." Gaston leaned back. "That's a very sophisticated explanation for an 8-year-old. "I read a great deal, sir. My mother was a teacher before she married my father." "And the animal mutilations?" "Stray dogs, sir, or drifters. The roads are full of disturbed men since the war." Your uncle's wife, Margaret Caldwell, corroborated Dr. Whitaker's concerns. "Aunt Margaret never wanted me in her home. She made that clear from the first day. She needed a reason to send me away, and Dr. Whitaker gave her one." Every answer was polished, every deflection seamless. Gaston listened and took notes and dismissed Timothy to his ward. That evening, Gaston wrote to Whitaker, "I have interviewed your patient. He is articulate, composed, and highly intelligent. I do not yet see the monster you described. I see a traumatized child with an extraordinary capacity for verbal reasoning. I will continue observation." Whitaker read the letter and immediately wrote back.
He is performing for you.
He performed for everyone. That is what he does. Do not let his age deceive you. Do not let his words deceive you. Watch his eyes, Gaston. Watch what happens when someone nearby is in pain. Watch what he does when he thinks no one is watching. September 1867. Gaston watched. Timothy adapted to the asylum with terrifying speed. Within a week, he had charmed the nursing staff. He was polite, helpful. He made his own bed. He assisted elderly patients to the dining hall. He read aloud to a blind woman named Mrs. Colbert every afternoon. The nurses adored him. "That child doesn't belong here," one of them told Gaston. "He's the gentlest soul on this ward." Gaston said nothing. He watched. October. A patient named Edgar Sims, a former soldier with severe shell shock who screamed through the night, was found unconscious in the washroom with a deep gash on his forehead. He had slipped on wet tiles, according to the incident report, but the tiles were dry when the orderly arrived. November. A female patient named Adele Fontaine, who occupied the bed next to the ward entrance, began refusing to sleep. She told anyone who would listen that the boy stood beside her bed at night, not touching her, not speaking, just standing there, breathing, watching, counting something she couldn't hear. Staff dismissed her. Adele was diagnosed with hysteria. Her testimony was worthless. December 1867. An orderly named Patterson, a large man who had worked at the asylum for 6 years, quit without notice. He left a letter for Gaston that read, "I found the boy in the basement storage room at 3 in the morning. He had a rat pinned to a board with sewing needles. It was still alive. He was drawing it. When I confronted him, he looked at me and said, 'You should be asleep, Mr. Patterson. People who wander at night see things they're not equipped to understand. I have a wife and 2 daughters, doctor. I will not spend another night in this building.'" Gaston read the letter 3 times. Then he went to Timothy's ward. The boy was sitting on his bed, reading a medical textbook he had borrowed from the asylum library. He looked up with that practiced, warm, innocent smile. "Good morning, Dr. Gaston." "Timothy, Mr. Patterson has resigned." "That's unfortunate. He was very kind." "He says he found you in the basement with a live animal." Timothy closed the book. "Mr. Patterson drinks, doctor. I've smelled whiskey on him several times. I'm not sure his account can be considered reliable." He described what he saw in detail. "Disturbed men often construct detailed fantasies. You taught me that. It's in chapter 4 of the textbook you lent me." Gaston stared at him, and in that moment, he finally saw what Whitaker had been trying to tell him. Not in the boy's words, in the silence between them, in the absolute stillness of those gray eyes, in the microscopic twitch at the corner of his mouth that might have been contempt, might have been amusement, might have been the closest thing Timothy Caldwell could produce to genuine pleasure. Gaston returned to his office and wrote a single sentence in his clinical notes. Whitaker was right. God help us all. January 1868. Gaston implemented strict protocols. Timothy was moved to an isolated room. His movements were monitored. His reading materials were restricted. His contact with other patients was limited to supervised daylight hours. Timothy cooperated perfectly. He followed every rule. He thanked the staff for their diligence. He told Gaston he was grateful for the structure because it helped him feel safe. And then, on February 6th, 1868, 18 months after his arrival at the Caldwell farm and 6 months after his commitment to the asylum, an orderly unlocked Timothy's room at dawn for the morning meal and found it empty. The window was closed. The door had been locked from the outside. There was no breach in the walls, no tunnel, no broken glass. The only thing left on the bed was the journal. It was open to the last page. On it, in Timothy's careful handwriting, was a message addressed directly to Dr. Gaston. "Thank you for the education, Doctor. The textbooks were very helpful. I've learned a great deal about how your profession categorizes people like me, and I've concluded that the categories are insufficient. You will not find me, not because I am clever, though I am, but because I understand you now, all of you, better than you understand yourselves. And a man who is perfectly understood by his prey is already caught. He simply doesn't know it yet. Yours sincerely, Timothy Caldwell." Gaston read the note standing in the empty room. His hands were steady, his face was gray. He folded the note, placed it in his breast pocket, and walked to his office. He sat at his desk for a very long time. Then he opened his filing cabinet, pulled out Timothy's complete case file, and stamped it with a single word that the asylum used for patients who had left the facility without authorization: escaped. But Gaston crossed that word out with a pen and wrote beneath it, in his own hand, a correction that would remain buried in state records for over a century: released himself. Gaston sent word to every sheriff's office, every asylum, every parish courthouse within 200 miles. He described the boy in precise detail. 8 years old, small frame, pale gray eyes, light brown hair, polite, articulate, extraordinarily composed. Dangerous beyond any measure the law currently recognized. Nobody found him. Nobody reported seeing him. Timothy Caldwell walked out of the Louisiana State Insane Asylum and dissolved into the American landscape like a drop of poison into a river. February 1868. Whitaker received the news by letter. He read it standing in his study, and when he finished, he sat down and did not move for over an hour. Eleanor found him staring at the far wall with the letter crumpled in his lap.
"Nathaniel, what's happened?"
"He's gone."
"Who's gone?"
"The boy, Timothy. He escaped from Jackson." Eleanor pressed her hand against her chest.
"How? He's a child. How does an 8-year-old escape a locked asylum?"
"Because he's not an 8-year-old, Eleanor. He never was. He wore a child's body the way a man wears a coat. Underneath, there is something older and colder and more patient than anything I have ever encountered. And now it is loose." Whitaker rode to the Caldwell farm that afternoon. He owed them the truth. He owed Margaret the truth. Caleb was on the porch, sober for once. The news had shaken even him. He stood when Whitaker dismounted and said nothing, just waited. "He's out," Whitaker said. Caleb's hands tightened on the porch railing.
"Will he come back here?"
"I don't know. I don't think so. There's nothing left for him to study here. He's finished with us." Margaret appeared in the doorway. She had heard everything. Her face was chalk.
"Finished with us? What does that mean?"
"It means we were his classroom, Margaret. This farm, this town, you, me, Josephine Monroe, Thibaut Bro. We were practice. And now he's graduated." Margaret leaned against the door frame.
"The children, James and Lucy.
"Are they safe?" Whitaker hesitated. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to offer comfort. But he had learned from Timothy Caldwell that false comfort was its own kind of cruelty. "I believe so. He had months to harm them and chose not to. James was too suspicious to be a useful subject, and Lucy worshipped him, which gave him cover. He's strategic, Margaret. He doesn't act without purpose. Hurting your children now would serve no purpose." "You're talking about him like he's a general planning a campaign." "That is exactly what he is." Caleb spoke for the first time. His voice was rough, stripped. "This is my fault. I brought him into this house. I ignored Margaret when she told me something was wrong. I was so drunk and so angry at the world that I couldn't see what was sitting at my dinner table." Whitaker didn't argue. He couldn't. It was the truth. "What do we do now?" Caleb asked. "We watch, we wait, and we pray he moves north." March 1868. Whitaker sent a personal letter to Dr. Gaston requesting Timothy's complete case file. Gaston complied. The file arrived in a sealed envelope 3 weeks later, and what Whitaker found inside fundamentally changed the direction of his remaining life. Gaston had documented everything. The charm offensive Timothy deployed on the nursing staff within days of arrival, the systematic study of other patients' conditions, the incident with Edgar Sims in the washroom, which Gaston now believed was deliberate, Adele Fontaine's terrified reports of the boy standing over her bed at night, dismissed as hysteria, but corroborated by scuff marks on the floor beside her cot that matched Timothy's shoe size. Patterson's account of the rat pinned alive to a board, and a detail Gaston had not shared with anyone until now. During a routine inspection of Timothy's room in November, Gaston had found a loose brick behind the bed frame. Inside the cavity was a folded piece of paper. On it, Timothy had drawn a map of the asylum. Every corridor, every room, every door, every window. The location of every staff member at every hour of the day. Shift changes marked to the minute. He had been mapping the building since his first week. Gaston had replaced the brick and said nothing. He wanted to see how far the boy would go. He wanted to study the predator in action, and in doing so, Gaston had given Timothy the time he needed to complete his map and execute his escape. Whitaker read the file twice. Then he locked it in his desk drawer and began his own investigation. Not of Timothy directly. That trail was cold. Instead, Whitaker began researching something no American physician had formally attempted before. He began documenting what he called moral absence, the total lack of conscience, empathy, and emotional capacity in an otherwise intelligent human being. He used Timothy as his primary case study, but he did not stop there. He wrote to colleagues in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and London. He described the boy's behavior without naming him and asked whether any physician had encountered similar cases. The responses were cautious but revealing. A surgeon in Philadelphia described a 14-year-old girl who had blinded her infant sister with a sewing needle and expressed no remorse. A psychiatrist in London referenced a young man of 20 who had drowned 3 cats and a neighbor's child in a pond and been found afterward eating his lunch with steady hands. A doctor in Boston mentioned a soldier during the war who had killed 7 men from his own regiment in their sleep, not for any tactical reason, but, as he later explained to a military tribunal, because he wanted to see whether the sound of dying differed between sleeping and waking men. Whitaker collected these accounts. He categorized them. He searched for patterns. He was building the foundation of something that would not have a formal name for another century, but he did not know that. He only knew that Timothy Caldwell was not unique, and that somewhere in the structure of the human brain, there existed a deficiency so profound that it produced individuals who could walk among the rest of humanity undetected, mimicking every emotion, performing every social expectation, and feeling absolutely nothing. April 1868. While Whitaker buried himself in research, the aftermath of Timothy's time in Baton Rouge continued to ripple outward. Ezekiel Monroe sold his property and moved his family to Shreveport. He told Ruth he couldn't live on land where his daughter had been murdered and her killer had walked free. Ruth didn't argue. She packed their belongings in 2 days. Before they left, Monroe walked to Josephine's grave, knelt in the dirt, and spoke to her. "Baby girl, I couldn't get you justice. The law doesn't see us. It never did. But I see you. Your mama sees you. And God sees you. And wherever that boy is, whatever he becomes, he will answer for what he did to you. Not to me, not to any sheriff or judge,
to something bigger and older and more patient than any of us. He placed a single wildflower on the grave, stood, and never returned to Baton Rouge. Margaret Caldwell stopped sleeping through the night. She checked the locks on every door and window 3 times before bed. She watched James and Lucy with a vigilance that bordered on suffocation.
She flinched at sudden sounds. She refused to let the children walk to the creek alone. When Caleb told her she was being irrational, she turned on him with a fury that silenced him for days.
Irrational? I fed that boy at my table. I washed his clothes. I let my daughter sit beside him and hold his hand and call him cousin. And the entire time, he was killing people and writing about it in a journal 10 feet from where my children slept. Don't you dare call me irrational, Caleb.
I will never trust my own judgment again because of him. He stole that from me. He stole my ability to look at another human being and believe what I see.
Caleb stopped drinking for 11 days after that. On the 12th day, he started again. Summer, 1868. Whitaker expanded his search. He contacted law enforcement in parishes across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas, requesting reports of unexplained deaths that fit a specific pattern.
Deaths ruled accidental but accompanied by unusual details. Animal mutilations preceding human deaths. Children or young men described by neighbors as unusually mature or strangely calm. Farm accidents involving precise injuries. Drownings in shallow water. The responses were slow. Many sheriffs ignored him. Those who replied often included dismissive notes. But scattered among the dismissals were cases that made Whitaker's blood thin.
A family in Natchitoches Parish reported their 12-year-old nephew, recently arrived from another town, who had been found standing over a dead calf with a pocket knife, methodically removing its eyes. The boy had been sent to live with relatives after his parents died. He was described as polite, quiet, and helpful. He had arrived 3 months before the animals started dying. The boy's name was not Timothy Caldwell. He was described as having dark hair, brown eyes, and a round face. It was not the same child. It was the same pattern. A sheriff in Hinds County, Mississippi, described a case from 1866. A 9-year-old boy, orphaned by the war, taken in by a farming family. Within 6 months, 2 neighbor children had died in accidents. Animals had been found opened with surgical cuts. The boy had been present at every death. He was eventually sent to an orphanage in Vicksburg, where he reportedly set fire to another child's bedding while the child slept.
He was transferred to a state facility. He escaped within a year.
Whitaker spread the reports across his desk and stared at them until the candle burned down. Then he lit another and stared some more. This was not one boy. This was a phenomenon. Rare, unrecognized, uncategorized, but real. And every case he found shared the same architecture.
A child without conscience, produced by circumstances of extraordinary violence and abandonment, moving through communities that were too broken, too distracted, too overwhelmed by the wreckage of war and slavery to see what was right in front of them. The South had created these children, not intentionally, not directly, but the machinery of slavery, the brutality of war, the collapse of every social structure that might have caught them early, all of it had produced a generation of damaged human beings. And among them, hidden in plain sight, were a handful who were not damaged at all. They were something else entirely. Something that functioned perfectly, efficiently, brilliantly, but without the one thing that made functioning matter: empathy. Whitaker wrote in his journal, October 1868,
I have now collected 14 cases spanning 5 states and 12 years.
The pattern is consistent. The subjects are young, intelligent, and superficially charming.
They arrive in communities weakened by war, poverty, or racial violence. They exploit the chaos. They study human behavior with the precision of naturalists. They kill without motive that any rational person would recognize, because their motive is not anger, not revenge, not profit. Their motive is knowledge. They want to understand how we work, and they do not care how many of us they must open up to find out.
1871. The years passed. Whitaker aged. His hair whitened. His hands developed a tremor that made surgery impossible. He retired from active practice and devoted himself entirely to his research. He tracked every lead, every rumor, every unexplained death in the South and Midwest that matched the pattern.
He traveled by rail to interview witnesses, examine records, and visit the sites of suspected killings. He spent his savings. He exhausted his health. Eleanor begged him to stop. "You're chasing a ghost, Nathaniel. You'll never find him." "I'm not trying to find him, Eleanor. I'm trying to prove he exists. Not just Timothy, all of them. If I can document enough cases, if I can establish the pattern beyond doubt, then someday, when medicine advances far enough to understand what I'm describing, someone will have the evidence they need to act. And if medicine never advances that far, then at least the record will exist. At least someone will have said, 'I saw this, it was real, and I refused to look away.'" 1875. Whitaker received a letter postmarked from St. Louis, Missouri. No return address, no signature. The handwriting was elegant, mature, and completely unfamiliar. The letter read, "Dear Doctor, I trust you are well. I have followed your work with great interest. Your research into what you call moral absence is closer to the truth than anyone else has come, though your terminology is crude and your methodology relies too heavily on anecdote. I suggest you focus less on cataloging symptoms and more on understanding function. We are not broken, Doctor. We are complete. You are the ones with the excess, burdened by feelings that cloud your judgment and slow your thinking. I have built a life, a successful one. No one suspects me. No one ever will. I'm writing to you not to threaten, but to thank you. You were the first person who truly saw me, and being seen, even by a frightened man with shaking hands, has a certain value. I will not write again, but I will be reading your work, always, with curiosity." The letter was unsigned, but Whitaker knew. He held it in his trembling hands and read it 7 times. Then he placed it in the case file beside the journal entries, the commitment papers, and the 14 reports from across the South. Timothy Caldwell was alive. He was an adult. He was functioning in society. And he was watching. 1890. Whitaker grew old. His body failed in stages. His mind stayed sharp. He continued writing. He continued documenting. He continued searching. Margaret Caldwell died in 1882 of pneumonia. She never fully recovered from the anxiety that Timothy had planted in her. Caleb followed her 2 years later, killed not by disease, but by whiskey and the weight of everything he had refused to face. James Caldwell left Louisiana at 18 and never returned. He told no one about his childhood. He married a school teacher in Ohio and raised 3 children, and never once spoke the name Timothy Caldwell in their presence. Lucy Caldwell became a nurse. She worked in hospitals across the South for 40 years. She never married. Colleagues described her as compassionate but guarded, a woman who cared deeply for her patients but kept everyone at arm's length. Late in life, she told a young nurse in Memphis, "I loved someone once who wasn't capable of loving me back. Not because he chose not to, because he was built without the part that makes love possible. I didn't know that as a child. I know it now." And it taught me that the most dangerous people in the world are not the ones who hate you. They're the ones who study you. Ezekiel Monroe died in Shreveport in 1889. His wife Ruth outlived him by 12 years. She never spoke of Josephine to anyone outside the family. But every year, on the anniversary of her daughter's death, she walked to the nearest body of water, stood at the edge, and whispered a prayer so quietly that even God would have had to lean in to hear it. 1891. Whitaker sat at his desk for the last time. He was 73. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the pen. His eyesight was failing. His lungs rattled with every breath. He opened his journal and turned to a blank page. I have spent 24 years studying the phenomenon I first encountered in the person of Timothy Caldwell. I have documented 31 cases across 9 states. I have corresponded with physicians on 2 continents, and I have arrived at a conclusion that I know the medical establishment will reject because it challenges everything we believe about human nature and childhood and the soul. He paused, dipped the pen, continued. Some human beings are born without conscience, not damaged, not traumatized into emptiness. Born without it, the way some are born without sight or hearing. It is an absence, not a wound. And no amount of love, no amount of discipline, no amount of prayer or medicine or institutional care can install what was never there. Timothy Caldwell taught me this. He taught me by killing a 5-year-old girl in 6 inches of water, and writing about it the way I would write about removing a splinter. He taught me by looking into my eyes and telling me I was useful. He taught me by escaping every cage we built for him, not through force, but through an understanding of human weakness so complete that our locks and walls and rules were meaningless. The pen stopped. Whitaker stared at the page. Then he wrote his final passage. If he survived into manhood, and I believe he did, then somewhere in America walks a man who understands us better than we understand ourselves. He knows our fears. He knows our patterns. He knows exactly which words will make us trust him, which expressions will make us love him, which silences will make us pity him. He moves among us perfectly disguised, because the disguise is not a mask. It is a skill, perfected over a lifetime. And behind it, there is nothing. No malice, no hatred, no rage, just hunger. The same hunger I saw in those gray eyes in 1867. The hunger to know what we are made of. The only question that remains, the question I will carry into my grave unanswered, is whether God made Timothy Caldwell as a warning to the rest of us, or whether Timothy Caldwell made himself alone, in the darkness, out of nothing but curiosity and the wreckage of a world that was too broken to stop him. Nathaniel Whitaker closed the journal. He placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk, beside the case file, the asylum records, the 14 field reports, and the single unsigned letter from St. Louis. He locked the drawer. He placed the key in an envelope addressed to the medical department at Tulane University, with instructions that the contents not be opened for 50 years. Then he blew out the candle, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. He died 9 days later. The drawer was opened in 1941. The contents were catalogued, filed, and forgotten until 1987, when a graduate student in clinical psychology stumbled upon them while researching the history of antisocial personality disorder in America. She read Whitaker's journals. She read the case file. She read the letter from St. Louis. And she wrote a single note in the margin of her research notebook, in handwriting that shook slightly as she put pen to paper. He saw it. 100 years before we had the language, before the DSM, before hair, Before Cleckley, before any of it, a country doctor in post-war Louisiana looked into the eyes of an 8-year-old boy and saw exactly what we now call psychopathy. And no one listened. The plantation outside Baton Rouge was demolished in 1923. The land was sold, resold, and eventually absorbed into a commercial farm that grew sugarcane. The creek where Josephine Monroe died was filled in during a drainage project in 1954. The limestone ridge where Thibaut Breau fell was quarried for road construction in 1961. Every physical trace of Timothy Caldwell's childhood was erased by time and progress. But the journal survived. The case file survived. The letter from St. Louis survived. And somewhere in the pages of Whitaker's final entry, pressed between the lines, preserved in ink that had barely faded after more than a century, was the truth that the good doctor had given his life to record. That the most terrifying thing in the world is not a man who wants to hurt you. It is a child who wants to understand you and feels nothing at all while he takes you apart to find out.